So good evening and welcome to our 5th event in this winter semester's GCSC keynote lecture series. My name is Jens Kugele and I'm looking forward to this evening with our distinguished keynote speaker, Antke Engel, and I'm looking forward to learn more about their work. And we'll have the wonderful opportunity to discuss with them the complexities of difference, modes of difference beyond classification, and also to engage in a conversation on ethical and political principles, artistic practices, and challenges to binary oppositions, particularly through the concept of queerversity. And as most of you know, our traditional keynote lecture series here at the center aims to offer a prominent platform for established scholars from Germany and abroad. And over the course of the semester, this series also provides an opportunity to get acquainted with interdisciplinary perspectives on the study of culture, and an opportunity to engage in an exchange with experts in their fields. And we are thrilled that we are able to welcome tonight Antke Engel, who, as some of you are well aware, has already published with our open access journal on culture a few years ago in the On Culture issue on ambiguity. Thank you very much again, Antke, for accepting the invitation and for joining us tonight. And tonight's event has been initiated and co-organized by members of our research area 3, Cultural Transformation and Performativity Studies, particularly Beate Absalon and Juliane Saupe. And in a second, I'll be joined by them, and they will elaborate on this a bit further. And before I hand over to them for a short introduction of our speaker, allow me to add, as always, just a brief note on the format of tonight's event. Directly after the lecture, we invite all of you and your questions and comments from the audience. And for those who are joining us online, during the Q&A, if you would like to pose a question or make a comment, please just enter a plus in the chat and we'll be happy to add you to the list. However, if you prefer to, you may also just write your question or comment directly in the chat and we'll be happy to read it out. Tonight's event will be recorded. The recording, however, is limited, as always, to the audio and video of our presenters, and the recording does not include the Q&A session afterwards, neither does it include any chat activity or any metadata regarding the participants of this session. So please join me in welcoming Professor Antke Engel, as well as Juliane Saupe and Beate Absalon, who will share some words of introduction.
Yes, thank you so much. I want to start with a quote to explain a little bit the context of where the keynote lecture and the masterclass from today are happening. I needed to write and talk openly, undefensively, and with explicit narrative pleasure about sexuality and sex. My favorite word was to lubricate a discussion, because it is hard to talk about sex and sexuality without everyone getting jittery, defensive, and ineloquent. This was a quote by a scholar called Lauren Berland that we are quite often talking about. And it is somehow putting into words a desire that Juliane and me kind of had, and why we wanted to think along, especially with artworks, with cultural material, with something very specific, to think along with them about sexuality, sex, queerness, and so on. And so 2 years ago, we started this discussion series called Ambivalent Aesthetics, Sexual Cultures and Its Representations. And today we had the 3rd edition of this series, so now we have a great trinity, which feels like more complete than just 2. It's very nice. We had like psychoanalytical aspects, art history, and today queerness. We had the pleasure that Antke Engel followed our invitation, and it was a writing workshop where we tried to queer up our writing, which meant, to quote our guest, writing queerly means finding pleasure in complexity, confusion, and conflict. And it was really a delight. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. And yes, now I'm going to give you the word.
Perfect. Now I have the great pleasure to introduce Antke Engel. Antke Engel is a philosopher working in the fields of queer theory, post-structuralist philosophy, and visual culture studies. They were one of the first and are one of the most prolific scholars in the German-speaking context to really think together queer and visual studies, so also queering art history, and to circulate Judith Butler's writing, actually, in a German context. In 2006, Antke Engel has founded the Institute of Queer Theory in Berlin, and since then functions as its fellow, as its director. They were Asa Briggs Fellow at the University of Sussex and visiting fellow at the Gender Institute of the London School of Economics, as well as the Institute of Cultural Inquiry in Berlin. And since 2003, Antke Engel regularly hold guest professorships in gender and queer studies. And I first encountered their writing when reading Wieder die Eindeutigkeit, Sexualität und Geschlecht im Fokus queerer Politik der Repräsentation. So here you really hear what I was speaking about, from 2002. And further monographs are Queer Theorie, Queer Pädagogik, just recently published in 2024, and also very important for our own thinking, Bilder von Sexualität und Ökonomie, queere kulturelle Politiken im Neoliberalismus from 2009. And besides many, many essays, which I cannot all name here, Antke Engel also co-edited Hegemony and Heteronormativity in 2011 and Global Justice and Desire, so a word really, really important for our own lecture series, Queering Economy in 2015. But with no further ado, and I'm really also looking forward to the conversation afterwards, I will now hand over the stage.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you, Beate and Juliane, for the introduction and also for the wonderful writing workshop that we had today, and that was also a great pleasure for me. And thank you to Jens Kugele for inviting me. So it's my second time here at the GCSC, and I'm really happy to be here again and to engage with you and also the online audience, hello, afterwards in the discussion. So, change this. Queerversity as an aesthetic principle is the title of today's lecture. And I will work on the theoretical concept of queerversity that Jens already mentioned, but I will do so through engaging with an artwork by the artist duo Renate Lorenz and Pauline Boudry, Glass is My Skin, which was exhibited in 2002. It was exhibited in Madrid, where the Crystal Palace is a presumptuous building of colonial power built in 1887, when Retiro Park, where it is situated, just turned from a former royal into a municipal park, now serving the bourgeois public. Today, the Palacio de Cristal is an art exhibition space that belongs to the Reina Sofia, Spain's National Museum of Contemporary Art. During the 2022 exhibition Glass is My Skin by Pauline Boudry and Renate Lorenz, the palace turns into a ghost haunting the audience. It gains a voice that speaks about its colonial history and colonial present. In my talk, I will engage with this site-specific installation, especially also focusing on the audio and live performance by Ariane Negrod during the opening days. The artwork, for me, functions as a dialogue partner on theoretical, political, and aesthetic questions. In particular, it invites me to considerations on queerversity as an aesthetic principle and on what I call queer-verse aesthetics. Queerversity is a refined version of diversity. It questions the neoliberal functionalizing as well as the conservative regulation of difference, which under the pretense of diversity politics foster injustice and violence. So far, I have mostly been thinking about queerversity as a political and an ethical principle. Recently, I started working on queerversity as an aesthetic principle that arouses the complexity of difference, its inherent conflictuality, and its potential to challenge relations of power and domination. Hereby, I will look at what I call modes and means of queerverse aesthetics, that is, concrete artistic practices that widen the understanding of difference, that is socially and culturally available. And thus support, and this is actually kind of like a wider discussion that I won't be able to go into, but that I'm working on right now. It thus supports politics oriented to what I call transversal justice. So I'm taking up this question of justice from the collection that Juliane just mentioned, and argue that transversal justice is simultaneously fighting difference as inequality, but fostering difference as particularity and uniqueness. So my question for today is, can art activate queerversity as an aesthetic principle that avows difference rather than suppressing, simplifying, controlling, or managing it? Reverberations of opacity. For Glass is My Skin, the artist duo Pauline Boudry and Renate Lorenz challenge the Enlightenment ideal of transparency, which materializes in Madrid's Crystal Palace glass construction. They do so not through a gesture of dismantling the monument of colonial heritage, but through emphasizing its contemporary haunting force. During the exhibition time, each hour, the palace fills up with smoke, exhaled by mirroring stages of surprising geometries. Slowly, the visitors lose sight of each other, get lost in the fog, and experience disorientation. And it was really amazing. Like, at a certain point, you were not able to see the hand in front of your face. Then a song sets in, moving from speaker to speaker all around the building. And that would be now your chance to switch.
Watch me. Mírame. Transparencia. Check me out. Watch me. Veme con mis ojos. Transparency, my currency. pasando a mis espaldas. Mírame a través de un extraño. See myself through the eyes of a stranger. Watch me, veme con mis ojos. I was in control, and now I'm falling. Check me out. Mírame a través de un extraño. See myself through the eyes of a stranger.
The lyrics, a mix of Spanish and English, tell the story of a me, a my, a me, who reflects on their transparency, uses smoke as a drug, and see themselves through the eyes of a stranger. Enigmatically, they are giving voice to the palace, to those who have been exploited and humiliated in the past, as well as in current neo-colonial capitalist systems. The song has been written by performer and musician Aira Negrot together with the artists. During the opening, Negrot was performing live, their vocal presence reverberating in the opacity of the space while they were crossing the ground with long striving steps, opening a gulf in the audience group, forcing people to step aside, who were nonetheless indulging in the proximity of a haunting ghost. That was really also an amazing experience because Aira Negrot was all over the place and you never knew where they were going next. And so the group had to move pretty fast actually in order to not be run over. And yeah, it's an amazing presence. Rereading the lyrics, I realize that only in the last two lines an I appears, an I that is falling. Writing this, my heart sinks because temporalities get even more haunting. It is as if these lines were prefiguring Aira Negrot's premature death only half a year later. Queerversity. The notion of queerversity draws attention to the complexity of difference, its inherent power relations, and correlating conflicts. I propose queerversity as a political, an ethical, and here an aesthetic principle. My thesis is that it holds the potential of fostering transversal justice because it combines intersectional and what I call plurimodal, I don't know whether this is a term, but many modes of plurimodal notions of difference. Whether or not this potential of fostering transversal justice becomes real depends on the de facto social, political, ethical, and aesthetic practice. How queer versus aesthetic work in a very particular case, and that is how dynamics of power and desire unfold, and whether those dynamics lessen power inequalities and overcome or reconciliate former violence. As I said, Queerversity, set up as a critique of neoliberal functionalizing and conservative, is set up as a critique of neoliberal functionalizing and conservative essentializing of difference. It questions the exclusively classificatory logic of difference and asks for complexity. Committed to intersectional thinking, it still acknowledges the cultural dominance of classified differences that are objectifiable and or governable. Yet, in calling the dynamic interplay of these classifiable differences heterogeneity rather than diversity, it underlines the relations of power and domination inherent to the social management of differences. Yet what is particular about Queerversity is that it distinguishes social heterogeneity from various modes of non-classificatory differences. These include multiplicity, that is, difference unfolding within a category, which remains uncountable and thus can neither be contained nor excluded. So even if we think about classification within any category, we have this excessive surplus happening. Furthermore, singularity, ambiguity, and irreducible otherness, and the irreducible otherness of alterity are modes of difference taken seriously by Queerversity, all of them resisting classification and essentializing. Queerversity proposes a simultaneity of different modes of difference, reigning social-cultural orders, undermining any fantasy of homogenizing the cultural or political field. It aims to strengthen the political potential of multiplicity, ambiguity, and alterity, which so far have been disavowed or depoliticized. Classifications and binary oppositions are not negated, but relativized and presented in tension with other modes of difference, thus mirroring and transforming social conflicts. Combining classification, multiplicity, ambiguity, and alterity puts a social cultural order on the horizon which disregards the illusion of homogeneity. Queer with aesthetics. My thesis is that Queerversity is constantly produced, negotiated, and revised by certain artistic practices that engage with what I call modes and means of queer with aesthetics. Those take on a particular role in subverting binary oppositions, either or logics, through opening up a space for singularity, ambiguity, multiplicity, and alterity. In playing on this spectrum of modes of difference, queer with aesthetic evoke a political dimension of art without functionalizing it for particular politics. Queerverse is the adjective of queerverse is the adjective of Queerversity. It avoids the identity or minority association of the term queer. Like mainstream culture, queer is simply seen as LGBTIQ, and thus kind of like somehow turning again into an identity. So queerverse avoids this while being also derived from perverse, recalling non-normative sexual dimensions. It aligns with the notion of queer aesthetics as used, for example, by José Esteban Munoz, who underlines its social relevance. This is a quote. Turning to the aesthetic, in the case of queerness, is nothing like an escape from the social realm, insofar as queer aesthetics map future relations. End of quote. With this in mind, I engage with the question whether and how artworks and art making activate the productive tensions between classification, multiplicity, ambiguity, and alterity. What are the artistic practices and modes of perception responsible for this kind of productivity? Could one say that artistic practices of artists or of audiences provide a privileged site for developing queerversity further and underlining its socio-cultural relevance? So I propose the term queerverse aesthetics as an analytical term for analyzing particular artistic practices, formal decisions, as well as modes of production and ways of addressing and engaging the audience. So this is kind of like the classical way of approaching cultural production, but I say, okay, we use another framework in order to get these dynamics of power and desire into our view. In the following, I wish to probe this in an encounter with Glass is My Skin, which, as I will argue, creates for the audience encounters with alterity, while simultaneously activating an intersectional understanding of, in this case, the heritage of colonial regimes with transgender and migrant embodiment. And that we also recognized in the lyrics were like this experience of Aira Negrod as a trans femme person who migrated to Berlin, I think, in the early 1990s. So coming back to the site-specific installation in the Crystal Palace, we see 6 stage elements arranged around in the space in unusual ways, upright and slanting, so that the mirrored surfaces reflect the architecture, the park, the sky, seen through the windows, as well as the visitors. I would like to draw attention to the viewing experience going along with it. The experience of finding one's mirror image on the stage element in intimate proximity with the building and surroundings carrying the colonial heritage. Noticeably, people were enthusiastically and often amused, performing in front of the mirrors, staging themselves alone or in groups, taking selfies. It seemed as if the surrounding did not get a lot of attention. Yet the surroundings inevitably sneaked in and created an unacknowledged background to the pictures, which also consisted of the soundscape as well as the changing levels of transparency and opacity. And so you also had a double temporality, so it was a concrete experience in the space with the audio, with the other visitors, but then also looking at your selfies afterwards, you might have realized that something sneaked in that you didn't realize when you were taking the photo. The installation creates, I would argue, supported by Negrod's vocal presence as well as an active audience engaging with the space, what I call uncanny encounters. What occurs are heterotopian spaces And there I refer to a concept that I've been writing on ages ago, but it came back to me, the third side of the mirror. These heterotopian third sides of the mirror allow someone to enter into unconscious areas where the other of the other resides. The other of the other, or the other of oneself, are those moments of alterity beyond the subject's control, where the projections and fantasies about the other do not no longer hold. Their difference may resist classification. Horror visions or idealizations might be activated, but simultaneously disrupted. A desire for the other of the other breaks up identificatory norms as preconditions of selfhood or desire. So the hope is that we also get out of this desire for the other, because we experience a desire for the other of the other. And this goes back to what, who was it, Beate or Juliane, mentioning this kind of like taking pleasure in confusion and maybe also inner conflict. I developed the third side of the mirror from feminist and queer reworkings of Jacques Lacan's mirror stage. Lacan proposes the mirror stage as an explanation of identification processes in subject constitution, explaining them as a form of misrecognition. Embracing and departing from Freud's narcissistic love, Lacan installs a necessary split into the subject, who dis/avows its dependency on others and on the social world. Yet in Lacan, it is still an identification process which defined positions of the self and other. Queer feminist authors, in contrast, underline the possibilities of disidentification, answering to discrimination and violence in the social world that take hold in psychic processes, desires, and sexual formations. Accordingly, I introduce the third side of the mirror as a concept metaphor for aesthetic practices that engage a desire that brings about a queer triangulation of an otherwise binary identification process, a desire for non-representable alterity. So this kind of triangulation I find important because as long as you have kind of like this subject-object self-other dynamic, you are kind of like reproducing the binary. So how can we triangulate that? And then I thought, okay, the mirror has these two dimensions. Someone is kind of like in front of the mirror. We have the mirror image. What if we walk around the mirror or find kind of like some kind of a third side of it? Whoever is placed in front of the mirror becomes receptive, passive, active, with an underscore, of the mirror image's third side. This includes the smoke, sounds, other visitors, the world transmitted due to the transparency, opacity of the building, as well as random objects in front of the mirror intervening in the relation between performing visitors and mirror or selfie image. One might like to ask whether the selfie practices gain political valence when they foster these encounters with the other of the other. When a third side of the mirror projects back on the beholders, the performing visitors are no longer in front of the mirror, but they are in another space and elsewhere, inhabited by object agents which draw the destabilized self into a scary but joyful experience, the psychoanalytic term of jouissance, a joyful experience of alterity. So this is kind of like what I think might happen. Of course, it does not need to happen, but there might be kind of like this projecting back of the scary, haunting, unexpected images in the mirror. Beholders are encouraged to bring in their individual biographies and social positionalities while being drawn into a queering exchange with the artwork. This is simultaneously a cognitive as well as an affective experience, employing multiple senses and unfolding in a relation with alterity. With Glass is My Skin, this produces a trans-temporal encounter with the heritage of colonial violence. Instead of recoiling, the third side of the mirror allows facing horror visions and reverberations of violence. So, Glass is My Skin, this is what I meant to show, activates a particular mode of what I call queer-verse aesthetics, namely encounters with alterity. And I guess one can also work on these other dimensions because I said, okay, there is a simultaneity of multiplicity, singularity, ambiguity. For this talk, I concentrated on this moment of alterity just in order to make it not too complex. And because I find this very characteristic of at least my experience in the exhibition space. So it activates this particular mode of queer-verse aesthetics, encounters with alterity. Those are brought about through the aesthetic means and practices employed by the artists, as well as the perceptive agency of the viewers. So this question of who is an active agent, what is the role of the visitors, particularly in this space that is an art space, but you can enter it for free, and it is in a park that is in the middle of the city, and tons of tourists are coming all the time. Glass is My Skin invites the audience, many of them coming as tourists rather than primarily seeking art, to co-create aesthetic form and explore aesthetic practice. Through opening a heterotopian trans-temporal space that I call the third side of the mirror, the installation fosters encounters with the other of the other. The third side of the mirror is a particular faculty of queer art and a mode of queer-verse aesthetics. It makes unconscious encounters livable and, so I hope, desirable. As such, it turns alterity into a positive expression for what in a rigid identitarian order is excluded as the object, that is not allowed to claim reality, is suppressed or disavowed. Thus, that which upholds the norm, as long as it functions as its constitutive other, may gain agency and enter the political stage. And so I come to the last paragraphs of my considerations that goes back to queerversity. When I propose queerversity as an aesthetic principle, complementing its function as a political corrective and an ethical attitude, this refers to different aspects simultaneously. Fostering a complex, multidimensional understanding of difference through aesthetic means, advancing queer theory through making conceptual proposals and reflecting methodological on making and reading art. Queer art invents articulations of difference that cannot be reduced to classification, thus undermining binary logic and antagonistic politics. Queer with aesthetics refers to the modes, means, and practices that bring about these effects. When queerverse aesthetics avoids binary opposition, it does so through queering and transing. And this is also something I will not elaborate on now, but I think that these that the insistence of transgender politics and transgender studies and saying queering and transing is not the same, and how can we actually kind of like understand these as different movements that may intersect but not kind of like dissolve in each other. So I would say that queering activates desire beyond one-dimensional identification and beyond heteronormative coupling, thus challenging normalcy. And that's also interesting because I think that this kind of queering challenges more than just heteronormativity. So it challenges all kinds of normality that becomes normalcy, that becomes kind of like a rigid understanding. And there you have all these intersectional intertwinements. So class and racial and racist regimes and ableism are part of this process of activating desire beyond one-dimensional identifications. And then transing moves through dualisms, not denying, but spiraling them in order to undermine their hierarchical arrangement. And I think that is an interesting move because there has been a lot of discussion also going on in decolonial theory about the dualism of male and female that incites certain cosmologies. And the question was kind of like, has this to be read as kind of like conservative or kind of like stuck within a binary order? And the argument is no, because these dualisms are perpetuating, and the kind of like the yin and yang figure is kind of like one that actually kind of like shows that. So one turns all the time into the other. There is a co-presence that is challenging each other, and this spiraling movement undermines the hierarchical arrangement. This is how intersectional analysis and plurimodal differences are intertwined, activating potentials of transversal justice. Creating encounters with alterity widens the field of justice because it allows to call unjust what does not take into account differences that remain queer even when they are embraced by the norm. Thank you very much.